Mexico's history is hardly a stable one. The nation, since its inception as a domain of the Spanish Empire, has seen the rise of revolutions, dictatorships, and even its own brief empires, one of which was established by France. See, during the mid-1800s, Mexico had locked itself into a civil war that would come to be known as the Reform War. On one side was the Liberal Party, and on the other was the Conservative Party. The US backed the Liberals and aided them in securing a victory, but victory came at a cost, a literal bill to pay for debts owed to the European powers. The Liberals and Conservatives had borrowed a substantial amount of funds to fuel their war effort from France, Britain, and Spain. And the agreement was that upon victory, the winners were expected to repay not only their debts, but those of their opponent as well, leaving the new liberal government saddled with a bill twice as large as they expected, which they outright refused to pay. The Second French Empire under Napoleon III's ambitious leadership would not tolerate this breaching of their deal and launched an occupation campaign of Mexico until debts were paid. But still, the new government refused, and so Napoleon was forced to install a friendlier regime that would deliver on dues owed, thus initiating what would become the Second French Intervention in Mexico, a series of military campaigns supported by Britain, Spain, and remnant conservative forces. The Liberals had hoped to rely upon the US once again to help them defend against the invading French, but the US by this point had found itself engulfed in its own civil war. So without the support of the US enforcing its Monroe Doctrine, Mexico City was eventually captured and a new Mexican empire was declared by the provisional government. All that was missing now was the right leader, and Napoleon had one in mind, an Archduke from Austria by the name of Maximilian, the younger brother of Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria. Maximilian had grown up in his brother's shadow, studying and training vigorously to demonstrate his superiority of leadership, but being consistently relegated to only Austria's second best. Despite this status, he excelled in science, military, and speaking fields, often being regarded as far more charismatic, lively, and tactical than his brother, yet the right to rule still escaped his grasp. One day his opportunity would come in the form of an invitation to take the Mexican crown. Unexpected, yes, but he was precisely the fit. As a Habsburg and the brother of the current emperor, there were few better choices to present the crown to. He was also a believer in true enlightenment and believed himself to be a bridge, that is, a uniter of the old world and the new world, a melding of liberalism and monarchy. A few guys actually tried that, and it turned out just fine. Napoleon had seen this as an opportunity to regain favor with the Austrian Empire by appointing one of their own to rule the newly conquered country. However, he likely didn't know how estranged the two brothers were by this point. Regardless, it was still a fine gesture, and I'm sure Austria would appreciate it to some degree. No matter Austria's perception, this still came to be perceived as a moment of great importance, as to some it signaled the revival of European monarchy in the Americas. Maximilian was given a holy blessing by the church and a fire salute by the Gibraltar garrison on the personal request of Queen Victoria, but this tale would not end well for Maximilian. Though a victory had been called by France, conflicts were not fully concluded. Maximilian's presence as a monarch wasn't very well welcomed by the liberals, but he retained enough support from the other factions to keep himself afloat. That was until the conservatives saw how much his views meshed with the liberal party instead of their own. Some of his first decrees being to limit the working day, open up voting eligibility, enacting a system of religious tolerance, and abolishing slavery, much of which flew in the face of his conservative base. But still he retained the power of France behind him. And then the American Civil War ended, French tensions with Prussia grew, and with that, the liberals saw a surge of support from the north, the French left Mexico to deal with troubles back home, Maximilian was left alone to be overthrown, and soon after, executed, putting an end to his plans and ambitions before they had even begun. But what if all that changed? What if Maximilian had flipped the script, and made the liberals a solid support base instead of adversaries? Well, in the end, it wasn't up to him. He had in our timeline extended an offer of not only peace and amnesty to liberal leader Benito Juarez, but even a position as his prime minister, all in exchange for allegiance to the crown. Juarez refused this offer, and in doing so assured a future of stagnation for Mexico, as his own somewhat dictatorial reign post-rule would be followed by the dictatorial rule of liberal president Porfirio Diaz, who despite making efforts to modernize Mexico was forced to abdicate in a series of events which would lead to the Mexican Civil War or Mexican Revolution. It doesn't matter, they've had a few of each, and this is just one of the bigger ones. In hindsight, the liberals seem to have steadily shot themselves in the foot, as Maximilian's policies had been so similar to theirs that neither he nor they really changed any policies of the other, and unlike the liberals, Maximilian could have attracted great investment from the European powers, as well as provide reliable leadership, thanks to both French support of him and American support of the liberals. In this timeline, we're going to propose that Juarez simply accepts Maximilian's call for peace, and the two set upon rebuilding the war-torn country. Concessions of resources are made to France in order to cover the debts previously owed. However, thanks to sustainable government and enforceable law via France, the country is able to move along as it was meant to following the Reform War. In addition to promoting greater equality across the land, Maximilian would work to bring the people across Mexico closer together by launching a massive rail construction project similar to the US's Transcontinental Railroad, and perhaps with French help, attempt to build a much-in-demand canal in its south to attract more trade. Maximilian in our timeline had hoped to bring in more workers and settlers to occupy the vast lands of Mexico by reaching out to his native Austria and even to the former Confederacy, assuring a job, housing, and citizenship to all able-bodied men, along with payment for those who brought their spouse and children. One might also argue that as thankful as Max had been to have his own land to rule, in the back of his mind, be he conscious of it or not, he always wanted Austria. While it's unlikely Max would change Mexico's primary language to German, he may encourage the teaching of English and German as second languages, as he himself was multilingual, and may promote the development of Austrian-like structures and housing in new settlements in an Austrianization or Europeanization process that would come to be known as the Maximilian Restoration, mirroring the Meiji Restoration, which would have simultaneously begun in Japan during this time. Max recognized Mexico as having much potential, yet knowing full well Spain did little to develop both its lands and people into what he considered proper Western men, asserting that it's no wonder such outdated policies had survived in Mexico, when Spain never properly bothered to treat the land as a Western domain. To Maximilian, this meant an emphasis on Catholic identity transitioning into a more liberal culture, surely earning him much scorn from the conservative population. It was clear to most everyone that Maximilian, if he was accepted, would still always be an outsider. And so to ensure his position as emperor in absence of the French, at the word of Franz Joseph and Napoleon III, a large Germanic population would begin its migration journey to their new home, and just in time too, as the US, once it regained its footing post-Civil War, would no doubt attempt to drive the French from their waters. The matter of dealing with Maximilian, however, is another animal altogether. If he was indeed supported by the liberals and backed by France, he'd be in an eerie gray category that would be difficult to remove, kind of like Canada. Realistically, we probably will see the US attempt to intervene at some point, just not right now. The Civil War would have just ended and focus would need to be on domestic issues. This would also likely fall during the presidency of Andrew Johnson, who infamously was blocked from making any major political moves by Congress. Though Max would still become an unliked leader in the eyes of the conservative rebels, whom the US could encourage by dropping some weapons near the border and hoping they get picked up. The Second Mexican Empire is eventually able to completely shed its image of a French or Austrian colony, as Austro-Hungary is established and the French Empire collapses following the Franco-Prussian War. Maximilian was not a strong believer in execution, having referred to his brother's crackdown on the 1848 revolution as unnecessarily brutal. However, he would need to take action against the high crime and rebel activity within the nation, and perhaps allow military and martial rule in less populated areas of the country, as he had allowed during the French intervention. As expected, Maximilian's rule would actually hit many of the same notes Diaz's rule had, though one might argue more or less successfully. A refusal to execute violent criminals as well as locking them up in the same place as political agitators would likely only serve as fuel for a revolution to come. In truth, Maximilian's rule may only last as long as he lives. As much support as he may have from a liberal base, and even from perhaps Austria or the French Republic, Max would eventually strike the same road bump Porfirio Diaz had, and while Max could delay the collapse longer, the additional factors of a less friendly US and a rising violent opposition would create a worse downfall for the nation than had been seen in our timeline following the revolution. It may be possible in this timeline for the Mexican Empire to expand into neighboring weaker Central American states, and perhaps even see a smaller break-off of a Maximilian loyalist Austrian nation in the region post-collapse, but ultimately it would still collapse. That would be the realistic end of the Second Mexican Empire, and what follows would generally be the same outcome we saw in our world of Mexico just being the destabilized Middle East of the Americas. But let's ponder an alternative. The Second Mexican Empire survives long enough to see World War I. This is a long stretch, but we could suggest martial and military rule clears out most conservative dissidents, or perhaps Max's successor is more religious and conservative himself, or just decides to simply silence any opposition. This could really only be expected from a successor of Max, perhaps someone else from the Austrian line who was more stern, because Max was simply too set on democracy, equality, and fair treatment, even if the war-torn nation was not yet ready for such a thing. The best thing we have to work with in this situation are the French and Austrian military leaders who stuck around in the nation, as well as the new Austrian immigrants. Similarly, as had been seen in Japan, an oligarchy of generals and wealthy businessmen could silently seize the reins of power from the emperor, relegating him to a mere figurehead, and quietly undo his liberal reforms while triggering a revival of traditionalism, using the newly developed industry to militarize the nation. So following Maximilian's death, his successor would inherit the throne with the special blessing of the Mexican Church. The oligarchs, to further cement their position, would likely groom Max's successor to be more Catholic and traditional, placing him at the center of the nation to represent a reborn Mexican identity, which would come to be a strange amalgamation of Spanish, Austrian, and subtle touches of Mesoamerican culture. Domestically, however, this becomes known as a Habsburg identity. This Mexican empire, while it would still be notably lesser in strength to the US, would be able to present a legitimate challenge to American dominance in Latin America, holding the advantage of proximity to balance out a number of conflicts which would arise following the Spanish-American War when the US began a series of Latin American interventions known as the Banana Wars. The aftermath of these conflicts lead to a virtual division of Central America and the Caribbean into Mexican and American spheres of influence, Mexico claiming all land north of Costa Rica, while the US took Panama and exerted dominance over the Caribbean islands, marking a new age of bad blood between the nations that would become the perfect motivator for Mexico to accept Germany's invitation to join the Central Powers. In our timeline, Mexico was far too destabilized to even consider taking action against America. However, if we assume Maximilian and the subsequent oligarchs had stabilized the nation and industrialized it to new heights, then suddenly the possibility for success emerges. The plan for Germany and Mexico is not to defeat the US, but simply siphon enough of their war effort away from Europe to ensure a victory for the Central Powers. In return, Germany would force the US to return southern lands lost in the Mexican-American War. Now, if in this world Mexico had thoroughly industrialized as Japan had, then not only would Mexico be able to create a diversion to occupy the US, but also provide more resources to the German war effort. Germany is now able to overpower France, which would effectively end the Great War in Europe. However, conflicts in America continue on as the Second Mexican-American War. Had Germany attempted to support Mexico, the best they could hope for would be to hold the ground they already have. An early end to World War I means US resources are also freed up to fully focus on Mexico. Germany could attempt a bombardment of the American coast, but the US could easily outlast them and gradually whittle down their warships. German troops could be routed through the Caribbean into Mexico, but these ships would no doubt come under heavy attack by the US, while ground forces mowed down any advance, creating a new entrenched front in Texas, which the US would eventually win, leaving us with a German-dominated Europe and a Mexican empire which isn't doing too bad, but isn't exactly noteworthy either. On a timeline that stretches far enough into World War II, and if we were to follow the similar parallels with Japan, then we may see the rise of a Japanese-Mexico axis to wage war against the US. Mexico with potential ambitions of claiming the West Coast, while Japan annexes US Pacific domains. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.